All right, everyone, welcome. I'm Channie. I am a freelance teaching artist throughout the city. Fellow human, I'm glad to be able to be with you all here.
Hi, I'm Amanda McFee. It's great to meet everyone. I'm the Director of Arts Education for District 75. Super excited to be here. I get very excited when there's like a room of people where you barely know anyone, just because it means that there's like more exciting people out there in the world, and the word is going out on how to support students with needs. So it's a very exciting day, and I thank you all for coming to our session. I was saying to Channie, it could be dense, but we're going to try to make it fun, and we promise it'll be supportive.
Yes. So let's take a moment to connect or ground, whatever the word may be, or center, to be able to allow us to occupize and show up in our fullness to give and receive. So what do we need? What sort of warm up would we like right now? Something that's solo, breathing internalized more, or a little more physical? Physical. I hear over
Olivia
Newton-John. Let us make a shape. A shape that allows us all to see each other. So you stand as you are able, filling the space here. Actually, I'll say fill the space. Oh, and allow yourself to begin to actually literally fill the space that's around you. Extend and allow yourself to say hello to Earth in whatever way that may be. Oh, what allows us to lengthen to Earth and to sky.
Oh, sorry.
And to also breathe and stretch to that which is all around from side to side. Our relations are connecting. And maybe we sway a bit. If that feels good for you. Right now, honor whatever it is that, listen to the body. Listen to what your bodies are telling you. And it might be we need to make something a little slower or a little bigger. Let's stomp a bit. Stomp. That same arm. And pause. Now we're going to cross opposite. And allow yourself to create a little free race. The rest of the spine wants to move. And slow down and pause in your own time. Gently shake. Gentle shakes that are maybe imagining that your heels are in gooey sand and allowing the heels to really melt into the sand, but it's from that surface that any vibration emerges, making its way up the spine, up the legs, if that feels good. Or maybe you're finding you need to start from the top, from the head. Shaking maybe. Let's make hands like this. And gentle pats, if this is comfortable, against your ribs. And if you feel any tenderness or any just response, just gently notice. Doing some energetic waking and moving our energy fields. And then if it feels good and you want to tap gently on the chest, the sternum. If any sound wants to emerge, that's all good too. Right on the sternum. And if it feels right and good, maybe we move to right underneath the clavicle. And here, I find that if I put my fingers like this, get right underneath the clavicle there. And if you're comfortable, we can go in with the same positioning, right? At the top of the cheekbones, under the eye. Yo, it's really different when you have a mask on, making that happen. I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to go to the middle of my forehead instead. That works better for me. And gently pitter-patter fingers on skull, on the side of the head, this jaw. When you are at your full, maybe you want to take it around the head and neck. When you're at your full, find a place to just be. And we let Earth support us. Take some of that which we might be holding so we don't have to hold it all. We expand, and also as we breathe and give. Heart to each other. How we feeling?
Great.
Shared a little, COVID's helped me discover some more Qigong practices, and so pulling in some of those ideas of moving our energy and our life source, our flow, whatever the words may be for you. But if we find that we're ever feeling stuck, our energy pattern starts to run in unilaterally. So we started here just to remind ourselves, but then when we want to try and reverse those directions so we're moving in our opposition, that's where we shifted here. That can be something done seated, standing, lying down. Any of these pulsations as it feels good to your body, the human body and touch, can be had in any posture or any body, meaning any B-O-D-Y, anybody. Hey, thank you everyone. Hey, so,
We're good. We got this.
everybody, we are here to think about our IEPs. One, shout out to each and every one of you that you are already naturally doing much of what we're offering as considerations as theater practitioners. Available to take a situation and improvise in order to make do with what the larger objective is. That's what it's about. Broadening our awareness, that sensing, that centering and grounding to allow us to be responsive versus reactive. And how do we fold that into how we do what we do, our pedagogy? You're already doing it. We shift and we slide. And we're offering that we think about shifting our thinking as a morsel at a time. Not the whole cake, not the whole lesson plan, but it might be a morsel of, do we give a moment to ask what the student needs at this moment for the moment versus bringing in? Or do we think of having a moment where there's some visual supports? Those are some examples. And an IEP, individual education program or plan, depending on the state, program here in New York City. So in Michigan, they use the word plan in Michigan. Program here. Gives clues to help you map out your journeys. Our goal is that after our time together, we can feel a bit more comfortable of how to read and understand, to let it serve you. So let's take 1 minute. There are markers here for you to, and actually, let's go to the next slide, please. Today we hope to explore how to best reach all students through adaptive activities to support students' goals and needs as articulated in the individual education program. We're going to take 1 minute. You may grab a marker. There is an IEP sheet and an IEP sheet. A graffiti boarding. Release any ideas or feelings about your relationship to the IEP. What I love, what I hate, what I don't know, what I wonder. When I think or hear the word individual education program, what comes up for you? Please put it on the wall. We'll take 1 minute.
As we're like, this is our shedding moment. The moment of release.
Yeah. And share a pen with a buddy, a marker I should say. 'Cause I don't know if there's enough for everyone to have one. All good. When I hear, when I see the words, the ideas on IEP, what comes up for you? Don't judge the quality of what comes up. Just put it on the page. And once you've had at least one idea, I'll ask that you pass so someone else can add their one thought. If you see something that someone already has noted, you can co-sign on it. Put a heart next to it, or a star, or a check. All right. Thank you, everyone. Amanda, is there anything that you've seen shared that you want to particularly highlight right now to help guide what our journey will be?
I have to say there's one thing on here that I really like. And it actually goes with the theme of the day of like students at the center, art at the heart, and also like our break into CRSE, which is culturally responsive and sustaining education. And a big part of that is that disability is part of that equation. You know, it's a person's, can be in a person's identity if they choose to identify as such. And so, and it goes into some other pieces of what we call in the special ed world, specially designed instruction. And everyone, you know, this statement of, in essence, all students have an IEP because each person is an individual and learn as such. And it's an important connection. And so that's a beautiful way of framing this, that an IEP is a helpful tool, and it gives us like these little snippets. Well, not little snippets. It gives us a huge amount of information on how we can adjust our planning to support the students in our class. And I saw something else over there on the board that talked about, like, sometimes when I look at an IEP, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, but it seems like it's a hindrance and I don't see the child's full potential. And so, like, how do we shift our thinking to use it as a tool for asset thinking, right? And like, what is asset thinking? And what does that mean when you come into a classroom and you're planning for how to reach every learner in your environment?
Mm-hmm. We'll check in on these boards again at the end of our time to see if the needle's been moved in any direction as it relates to any of the responses relationship to. Amanda just highlighted the idea of universal design for learning. How might we think about, I learned that Channie process has a slower processing and may need to have more time. So we're talking about an accommodations written, needs more time for testing. So then how do we translate that into our theater world? Perhaps then actually we provide We just give more time. And maybe even, so we structure an activity that we do maybe less, try to accomplish less within that amount of time to allow for more space. And everyone could benefit from that. That's an example of an adjustment that's thinking like universally how it can impact everyone. And I think we're at a moment for sure where it's okay to have some space to just breathe, and every moment doesn't have to be filled. So then do we think about also then having opportunities for, oh, well, these students, they always finish, they always need to have something else going. Oh, I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong
Has
direction.
everybody heard of the term universal design for learning? Is anyone not familiar with it? It's totally fine. It's like one of those words that's like surfaces in and out with the DOE. But when we're thinking about an IEP, when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching and sustaining education, like Channie was just saying, it is a change that seats and serves the whole, right? So minimal changes to an environment can have maximum impact. And so when we reframe our planning or just start thinking of our planning as more of a reflective practice and learning the students in the room and thinking about not just academics but also the environment, what are some changes that we can make that are going to have exponential impact on a student's growth for independence, communication, and learning. So we just threw this in there, so it'll be in the slide deck so that you have it, because when we think about UDL, it's engagement, it's representation, and it's action and expression. And having just this framing in your mind, we know that as a teacher and as an educator, especially as a theater teacher, all of this exists in your environment. When Channie and I were talking about this session, I was like, this is inherently happening in every aspect of your classroom every single day, just in the nature of the content. And so when we think about working with students and their skills and building skills, theater and drama class is what we like to call we're generalizing into a natural environment. So this class content is a natural environment for all of these skills to take place. So you may be adjusting and adding in some sort of accommodation or adapting the space, but there's not such a gross need for that modification of the content, which is a very exciting thing because you're a practitioner and an expert in theater instruction. So it's just thinking about the entry points of where a skill lies, which gets a little bit more difficult when you're in high school and you're working with students that are cognitively early learners. But because you are such an expert in your area and your discipline of the arts, he's like, he's like, expert's a strong term, yeah. But you are, because you know it. And when you think about it in that aspect, what is the building blocks if you're working on devising? Like, it's getting kids to respond to WH questions. There are all these things that when you look at the entry point skills, you're like, oh, I've got this. So we're just hoping with framing this session today to make you feel have a greater sense of confidence at the end that you're probably already doing this, and it's just speaking to it and understanding where that information is coming from. So when we talk about engagement, how have we changed our environment to be more engaging for the student? And that goes back to knowing the student and the information of what their interests are that you can find in an IEP, but that also ties back to culturally responsive, sustaining education and knowing the student well. So I guess what we're trying to say is that there's all these terms coming at us and all these new ways of thinking, but it really is that basis of knowing a child well and making planned decisions based on that student and where they are and where they need to go to have them achieve. Does that make sense to everybody? Sorry. I know that there is this new thing that you're not supposed to say. Does that make sense? Like, as a female? But just doing a check-in for understanding. And then it goes into representation. And so Channie touched upon that a little bit when we think about representation. What is representation in the classroom? It's visual symbols, it's maybe directions on the floor, maybe it's adding poly spots, maybe it's adding a visual schedule. How many people do that in their class already? Right? And so it's just thinking about maybe you need a greater support in the class for one student or another, or a subgroup of students across your day. And then the action, it's that physical place where students actually can be independent in the task. And so it's kind of an interesting thing when you think about it, because the goal of UDL and the goal of using an IEP and the goal of academic achievement is creating expert learners who are motivated, knowledgeable, and goal-oriented. But that basically means that a student's advocating for themselves and their needs and leading towards self-efficacy, right? Like, we want every student to have an idea of where they want to go, and we're facilitating that journey for them. Okay, so as we go back, so thinking about universal design for learning and why that's important and why IEPs are important, we think about the piece where Channie was talking about, that one change that maximizes the potential for everybody. So a lot of times, just to like make a concrete connection to it, it's the curb cut effect, right? Curb cuts were designed with the intention for people who use a wheelchair to be able to enter a sidewalk or enter a space, right? And so because of this one small change to our environment, there's now like graded bumps in a direction where people with visual impairments can actually know which direction to cross the street. There's people that are using walkers that are able to go across, grocery carts, strollers, think about when you're moving. I know, I just moved the other weekend, I had a wagon. I was like, thank God I don't have to pick this thing up, and there's little ramps everywhere around my neighborhood. So that one small change for one specific population of people was an exponential change and help to the entirety of the populace. So framing it in that way, it's thinking about what do I need to change to support a student based on what's in their IEP, but that is also going to benefit the rest of your class because we're generalizing that environment for students to be independent and successful. And if I'm talking too fast, I apologize. Just tell me to pause. So one thing that we wanted to make you aware of, has anybody ever heard of SDI, or specially designed instruction? Okay, so this is one of those, it's part of the special ed laws. And what specially designed instruction is, I have the exact definition here, as I'm like, should we go in for the, so it is adapting as appropriate to the needs of a student, the context, the methodology, and the delivery of instruction. So,
adapting as appropriate to the needs of the student?
Right, adapting as appropriate. So that all falls back to that knowing the student well, utilizing this document to know where the student is, being an expert in your content to know if they're here and I need to get them to here, what are the steps in between, right? What are those entry points to have that student's on a forward trajectory? And the blueprint actually helps a lot with that, right? Because you're like, oh, here's second, fifth, what are the benchmarks? It's kind of laid out for you already. But it's just thinking about how do I use all of these documents that can seem very dense and overwhelming to put together a plan so that I'm making sure that their students are progressing and moving forward. So when we think about SDI, and it's exactly what this person was saying, that individualized education for each individual student is, as an educator, what we're doing for everybody, right? So as your students come in and you're doing mini formative assessments, or you've read the IEP, you've done maybe a pre-assessment for your year to kind of ascertain where the students are, or you've had a conversation with their homeroom teachers and said, where are students falling this year on different levels throughout their other academic areas. And in a perfect world, that conversation takes place, and then you know where to begin, and then based on the knowledge of your content, you're like, oh, okay, we're starting here. And this class is going to move slowly and slowly towards is going to move in an ever forward motion to accomplish that goal. Okay, so this is a lot of text on the screen, and we apologize. I hope it's not, I was saying to Tim this morning, I was like, this is either going to fall like Bueller, or it's going to be totally fine and helpful. But when we talk about accommodations, so we talked about appropriate accommodations for students. So you're going to either adapt or you're going to modify. And sometimes these words get a little tricky and people use them interchangeably. But when we're talking about adaptations, that's the physical shifts, right? That's the shift to your environment. That's a shift to your classroom. That's adding visuals. That's adding placement and directionality with tape or polyspots and things like that on the floor. If you're using pencils or things like that, maybe it's a grip. Maybe it's a ball on the end of something, so a student can paint a set because they have fine motor dexterity needs and they need something to grip onto some sort of equipment. So those are adaptations, where that's physical adaptation so that a student can be independent. Then we have modifying, which is still, when you start modifying, it's when you're slightly changing the content. But when we're changing the content, it is not going from, oh, today we're going to devise, but I'm not really sure where to begin, so we're going to read from a book and do reader's theater. right? So that they're not necessarily aligned. So it would be like, how am I taking what the actual activity is, understanding my content and knowing where the entry point is for that. So if our major goal is doing a devised show, the entry point for that would be probing questions for the students. Pretty simple, right? Just keeping because I feel like sometimes we use them interchangeably. Channie's looking at me.
Yes, let's talk about stage directions. That is one of the basic essentials.
Yeah.
How we might go about getting to the goal of learning stage directions is what the modifications come in. It's still the same content. Yes, yes. So we still can maintain what our learning objectives are. It's just how we go about making it. Like a fork instead of a spoon, for example, to mix the batter.
But we're still mixing batter.
Yeah, still mixing the batter.
We're still mixing batter.
Yes.
That's a good one.
Let's
That's
boogie
better. Sorry, I get in like special ed DOE land. Okay, so this is where I promise you, an IEP is the most helpful tool for students with disabilities. And we have some extras should you want, but we also put a blank one in there just so if you had questions about where things were and what things should be in there, that you have access to that. But we put the sections that are, when you have students with IEPs in your class, everybody is responsible for supporting that child's program, right?
Excuse me a minute.
Sure.
There's 5 physical copies if anyone would like a physical copy right now.
And so, fantastic. So when we start off, we have this beautiful individualized education program. They seem kind of dense. They can be very long. So what our hope is today is to try to show you that there are some spaces that are more high leverage to give you information so that you can really work on these goals and really find out how and what that student needs to be successful, where they need to go, where they currently are, and there's going to also be some directionality on how. So that's going to really support your planning for each individual student. So in the present levels of performance, you find their evaluation results. So is everybody familiar about who is responsible for creating these documents? So there is a team of people that work with the student. It is a document that is done every year. Every 3 years, it's done with the assistance of a school psychologist. And so every year through this annual review, there is assessments done on the students, there's observations done, there is a lot of data taken to create this plan. And when this team comes together, they're also working with the family and the student themselves to help figure out like where, to give a very explicit, detailed summary of where the student is and the supports they need to be successful and what their trajectory is for next steps. And so this is done every single year. So in the present level of performance, as noted, the present level, right? You're like, oh, plop, that's what it means, right? So this is gonna tell you where they are academically, where they are in social development, where they are in physical development, and what their management needs are. Well, don't you wish that every student came into your class and they were like, this is what I need for their management needs, this is where they are socially? Like, think about theater. It's all about physical movement, social interaction, communication, and how am I gonna manage a student in an open space? We're not in a space like this. We're in a huge room with curtains and seats in an audience a lot of time. I mean, in a perfect scenario, you're in the auditorium, not just necessarily in a class. She's like, lofty goals. So in the present levels of performance, you're gonna find all these amazing things. So one of the things here's an example of one of the students that I worked with, and this talks about this
would be a moment we don't need.
Okay.
She's like, or turn to Amanda.
Sorry.
On Amanda.
So in their rate of progress, this is always in the pub. Learns with visual and verbal directions as well as modeling from staff. They need multiple opportunities to practice their learned skill. They form better tasks
New tech.
Performs better.
I was like, wait, what? Performs better when new tasks or skills are presented with hands-on activities and modeling. So what is that statement telling me for the student to be successful?
They need to see it.
They need to see it.
They need to do it.
They need to do it several times.
They need to touch it.
They need to touch it. Is that helpful information?
Yes.
Like insanely helpful information, right? Learning style is a visual learner who benefits from visual cues, prompts, with the use of spoken materials, and with multiple opportunities for practice and repetition. What we just said. Able to, this is important, able to complete a task when it is broken down into smaller steps and is guided with visual prompts and modeling. So maybe when we're talking about something like stage direction, it's chunked into like very small. Step one. Did you ever? Was that a stretch or a hand?
I was talking.
I was like stretch
I was
hands.
talking with Chadwick the other day. It's because as a new teacher, we walked into the room, and then I came from a theater background before I went into the classroom, and I had the idea of like, we're going to do this project, and so I'm going to show them the project. And then when I walked into a 8-1-1 class and I tried to show them the whole product, they were just, so I had to do one, let's do happy to angry today.
Yeah, exactly, that's it. Like, maybe my goal is a little too lofty for the students in this specific class, but for the next class, they can see big picture and run with it, right? So very beneficial things in here. Benefits from the use of adapted texts with visuals, checklists, and teacher modeling. Adapted texts, that can be something that it's read aloud. That can be something that it is the use of symbolic representation of text. Not Symbolate, if anybody uses that, where it's like one picture for every word, because it's very confusing, just dropping that in. But one symbolic representation of vocabulary, which will be another PD on in its entirety. But those things are very important, right? Adapted text. Natural Reader is something that is in every software program now, right? You can use it on Microsoft, you can use it on Apple, like great in-app software, so that if the student's reading dialogue, maybe it's reading it for them into their ear and they're replicating that information. Yeah?
I was gonna say, all that is what you were saying with the person that every IEP, like that's good for every single kid in the classroom.
Yeah.
Huge, exactly. Every kid benefits from like chunking the information, possibly modeling, right? It's like teaching practices 101.
Also, if you have teaching aids and you're doing multiple characters, you can read in, you can have you behind one student and another have another student. And in that way, they're hearing different voices, so they know which voice they hear. Because a lot of times, if I'm the only one reading in, everyone will repeat what I said. But if I say, "You're repeating what this person said," you're repeating what that person said.
Yeah, that's huge. Like thinking of those environmental changes, right? Like how are we utilizing our environment too? That it's not always just content.
And that's a demonstration of cueing.
Mm-hmm.
What you're talking about is cueing. That's essentially
Exactly.
the
It's
word.
natural in theater. Like I'm telling you, you guys are doing all of this all the time.
And
it's
we're at
there.
our 30-minute mark.
Oh gosh. Okay. Go for it.
I don't.
Yeah.
So this is what I meant by like, I don't always find IEPs like helpful in the sense that the students, their difficulties manifest completely different in a theater class or in an academic class as opposed to a performance class. And so I sometimes put like distance between myself and meeting the children and then seeing like the IEPs or talking to the homeroom teachers or whomever, because it's like I want to see, I just want to see the whole child first, because sometimes the modifications or accommodations that they might need in an academic class, they don't need in my class, because not that they don't need it, it's just that it's not as helpful in the same way because it's a completely different class.
This is an amazing thing. If I can go first, and then I'm gonna.
Yeah, I was gonna say that maybe you're subconsciously already meeting those needs, because theater is very interactive, and just from reading that IEP right there, I can tell that that if there is spots on the ground, and like if that child is moving around, or if that child is getting those cues that you're already meeting those needs without having to accommodate or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
no,
so you're
and then
already
so-
doing it,
and then
and that's why
having
they're
this packet
successful.
that feels like, it's supposed to be a manual or whatever, it can become very overwhelming. Because over the years, I've wound up making changes, like I've implemented checklists for all students, I've implemented, graphic organizers for all of it.
But so what you both just said is exactly kind of where we want you to start framing and thinking about your practice as a theater and drama teacher. That, that coming in with the asset mindset. Like, it's all about having reflective practice and seeing the student's strengths and seeing the entire child. And like we said before at the beginning of this, theater is a very natural environment for all of these skills to be built and the content not modified. Like, they're able to engage with their age level peers on the same, like, on that academic level, right? Because you're constantly modeling, you're constantly working on cueing, you're working on prompting, you're working with visuals. There's all of these things that occur during a practice or like when learning a new skill, that having that ability to actually go in and say, you know what, I'm gonna take a moment and I'm gonna like meet this child where they are and see how they interact in my class. Because a lot of times what we find with students is they are very successful in the areas of the arts. It is an area where it's almost failure free, because the student is not hit with text that they may not be able to read and comprehend. They may not have strong writing skills, so this area is something where they're exchanging in dialogue. The supports are naturally there. So having that opportunity, like, it's a necessary piece to read the environment or to read this document to know the students and what they need and what their goals are. But it's a huge, very important thing to see how the child interacts in the environment before making all these grandiose changes. Because yeah, maybe at the beginning of the year, they needed a checklist and they needed a visual schedule. But as you've repeated a practice, repetition is huge. Repetition leads to mastering of skills and independence, right? So when we have that, repetition means like doing something, the same concept every day, but in a different way so they can generalize that, right? So you're doing that naturally in rehearsal. So on day one in September, they may need that, but then in 2 weeks, maybe they don't. Or maybe, like you see where they are and have that on the side, because we're adapting and we're changing, it's changing, you said in the beginning, that we're being responsive to the students in our classes. So when I
have a quick question. Is
Sure.
there a certain language that sort of tags along with the IEP and the modification? Just because I don't have any more than one class in graduate school about IEPs, it's is there a textual reference for the diagnoses and the modification?
No, because it's all individualized.
Well, that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. Where's the language for the IEP coming from?
Oh, okay. So retract what I said. So the language is coming from the team and the parents and the family, the team at the school, and the student. And so though the language, finding out, so a diagnosis would come from a medical practitioner or a psychologist depending on the disability or the need of the student, but the language that you're finding is going to be based on the assessments that they've done that show where the student is right now and what the student is advocating for as their own needs from their understanding of themselves, family needs, and qualitative and quantitative analysis from the environment. So there's which we can get into and have another, because that is a very loaded question and very important, but it does come from a team of people.
I also find that when the people who create the IEP, what I found in the last two years is when I can convince the psychologist or the speech person who's written it in their language to come into the classroom and help you and push in and things like that, they're more willing to help it and they understand what's going on and then they can communicate what they're doing there and what we're doing.
Exactly. So all of this is developed on the base. It's from a team that creates the document based on assessments and evaluations of the student, which just means they're, whether it's been a performance task or a test or something like that, that there are multiple facets. It's actually a lengthy process for them to come up with the language for that, which we can go into.
And in my experience, ideally it's also written in language that the family will understand.
Yeah.
Hoorah.
Keeping it person-centered speak.
Mhm. Yeah, it's always written in language that it's not supposed to be like edu speak from the DOE. It's supposed to be in language that is family friendly, that the child can understand, because they are also a key component of the team that is helping support the students' learning.
Especially when they get to high school because they're going
Yeah.
to
Amanda,
get
I'd like
same.
to suggest we bump
Yeah.
go to the goals segment.
Perfect.
Because we are beyond
We are
our
beyond.
goals
We're
for time
good.
at this moment.
We're good. I promise. Sorry, great and important conversation. So, another part, but just to continue on this, you can also find the management needs. Sometimes people are asking, like, how can I support behavior in my class, or what structures do I need? Already in there in the present levels. There's also a space where you find measurable and that are the goals for the student. And when they say measurable, that means that they're projected to be achievable by that student in a calendar year. So from the opening up the IEP to the closing of that, and they're tracked through, they're tracked multiple times a year. So the annual goal, there's the criterion, the method, and the schedule. So it's the goal, how it's being measured, or what will be determined, what is the determination of achievement, the method and is how you're doing it, and then the schedule, which how many times a year are you checking this. So when we look at this, here's a speech and language goal that's an example. We will verbally communicate sentences of 3 to 4 words in order to create familiar staff members by name and answer WH questions and advocate for himself. So there are some places in there, like we said before, is this something that you can ascertain information from? Right? Thinking about how am I supporting the student's growth, making sure that we're working on things where I'm asking that student WH questions and not letting them just respond with a one-word response. Right? So that's one of those things that we're just shifting our thinking and our planning to making sure we're helping to meet that goal. The second one will follow a personal schedule by going to a designated area and beginning the activity task, right? We already talked about how a lot of the times we have visual schedules in the classroom to support a student's learning. So if you are adding those, like you said, maybe they've mastered that and that's information that you can take back to the classroom team saying, you know what, with repetition I have found that the student can do this. So you're also supporting that goal. One of the other places that we wanted to show you that has really, really important information is the IEP recommended special education programs and services. So in this, it's the special education program, so it's going to say whether they are in an ICT class, they have sets, they're in a 12 to 1 to 1, a 12 to 1, 15 to 1. Their related services, their supplemental aids and services, and assistive technology and supports from the school personnel. So at the bottom of this list, where we see supported supplementary aids, assistive tech, and supports from school personnel, this is loaded with information that will help you support the student in your classroom. And it even says, if you go back, the recommended delivery and the location of where it's happening. So in here, like this student has books and worksheets in alternative formats, probably with picture symbols or being modeled like we saw before. Channie talked about this earlier, extra time to complete tasks. So maybe the goal that we had to complete in a 52-minute period needs to be less than to give time for processing and practice in the classroom. Adapted texts, manipulatives, and organizers, graphic organizers for information. So if we're writing dialogue or we're writing scripts in our class, what does that note catcher look like for the student? Okay. Now, testing accommodations, I know it sounds pretty wild that this would be in there, but I promise you this is also a place to find really helpful information. So when you look at the implementation recommendations, you can see that the directions read and reread by a human reader. Maybe there's somebody, Donald touched upon that earlier, maybe there's somebody that is working as cueing or reading direction, maybe you have a student pair for that student. They need double time, they need a scribe, right? So things like that to think about depending on what you're working on in the class will help support that.
Sorry, quick question. So we were talking about like making these modifications for like the entire classroom because you find them, or the addition of these things would be not only helpful to the one student.
Yeah.
Do they then become, I know this sounds really weird to say that they're not as individualized anymore because
Well, it's not necessarily that they're not individualized anymore. So one of the pieces that when you're working with students in your class, you never want to separate.
yeah.
Like you always want to be inclusive.
Yeah.
So integrating that into your practice, saying that if you have a visual schedule somewhere in the room, doesn't mean that you have to make one for every student in the class, but if it's there, another student could reference it.
Can I give you a specific example?
Of course.
Okay. So, when I would do like a vocabulary quiz or something like that, I would, when I first started teaching, I would say like, okay, this is gonna take 10, 15 minutes. I decided, let's just make this like a 30-minute thing, and then anyone who finishes early can just draw on the back of it, and I give them a, like, write me a letter, tell me about what you love about theater class or something like that. I would also read all of the words out loud and then all of the definitions out loud. Like basically I'm reading the entire test out loud. Students who want to can jump ahead, and then at the end I say, is there anyone who needs me to read another word out loud? And then students can ask me to read them for like a third or fourth time. I mean, like, I implemented that because I noticed students needed, had directions read and tests read and things like that. Does it lose its power because I've done it now for the entire class? Does there need to be another step to make something more individualized for like a specific student now?
I mean, you could do like a subset of groupings if the student needed them individually read with each question. But that's something that you can ask the students themselves. So when you're reading as a whole to the group, that's something that at the beginning of the class there can be, we're going to go over everything and read a word bank collectively. Sometimes it will be more difficult for a student to recall what was read and where it was on the sheet. So as you're entering that at the beginning of the course, walking around and making sure and giving students that space to say, I need more support, so you're teaching the student how to advocate, and then also noticing and going around and just like checking, because maybe they are at a level that they're able to recall that information and then take the test on their own. But it's not something that maybe thinking of, that would not be an example of where you're lessening that, and there's not, because when you've designed your classroom in this circumstance, where you're giving students the option to advocate for themselves if they need more help, but also kind of going into a space and saying, because maybe it's something that the student maybe needs their own quiet space to take the exam, but having that conversation with the students prior is a way to send that extra piece of individualized support.
Also, there's no practice in a D75 classroom or addressing an IEP. There's no practice that isn't good for the collective.
Yeah.
Right? Doing all of those steps, it just helps everybody. There are kids without diagnoses who are not visual learners and need to hear it.
Yeah.
And so then the feedback you get while watching that is, as Amanda just said, you're checking in with those students along the way, asking them directly, but also just what you're seeing. So it's not like you're lessening by adding. It's an asset model. You're helping other kids. Yeah. There's a question back, a comment.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it goes back to what Amanda showed earlier with the curve effect. When you're thinking about accommodations, you're really just thinking about ways to make the content accessible to everyone. And I think what you're bringing up too is that we often think separate but equal, but it's been proven throughout history, whether through social economics, whether through the classroom, racial dynamics, that that's not the case. And so just by enhancing, looking at one student or a few students and adding it to the collective, it doesn't take away from what those 1 and 2 students need. And in fact, when you're talking about advocacy, a lot of people, kids or adults, don't even necessarily know what they need in certain moments until they have access to it.
Yeah.
And so it's then our job, I feel, to like make sure that we're exposing them to different strategies, different coping mechanisms, things like that, so to build their own advocacy and agency for themselves, to recognize that, oh, I do benefit from this, and this is just helping me. And there's a lot of the times people aren't necessarily identified with the IEP or extra needs, whatever. It can even be students with, who come from an ENL background who benefit from those visual cues, or just different moments of accessibility, like with the curve. Okay, it might have been for people with What's that rolling activist? Anyway, I can't remember her name, but you know when you think about the curbs, Judy Human, where it's like, okay, this is for disabilities or specifically people with wheelchairs, but we know if you have any kind of ailment, you might have an invisible disability, you could be young and have a disability, you could just need access to bring you something on the street. It benefits everybody. So when you're thinking at those most at risk, whatever it is, it's like it still benefits everybody else, benefits from that.
Yeah. And just, we'll go back and then right behind.
I think that you might be looking at it in a skewed kind of way, only because when you give everybody a choice, right? Those students that want to move on, that have the ability to read and can continue on with the lesson or like the quiz that you're giving them. You're meeting the needs of that student that has the IEP, yet you're still giving choice. So it's meeting the needs of all the students at once. So I wouldn't say that it would take away or lessen the need of the student who has the IEP, but instead give the children the choice to listen in on what you're providing as help for the student with the IEP or allowing them to go ahead. The moment you give them that choice, it puts them in the driver's seat of their education.
Exactly.
So, and I also feel like providing the option also to utilize all these different types of tools for everybody makes that maybe that other student who does have the IEP feel also more included.
Yeah.
I know for example, I have a sensory wall and fidget wall in my classroom, and I open up to everyone. I'm like, this is the fidget and sensory wall. If you need a piece, or if you need something, you need a tool to help you focus, or you need a tool to help you stay on task, grab that tool. If I see that the tool is not helping you focus, I'm going to ask you to find a different tool to help you focus.
Yeah, and
it really helps. Like, I don't know.
And what just happened in the room right now was such an amazingly beautiful thing, that the undertone of life skills that is happening, we are teaching students to be advocates, right? How often do we sit and work with our students on what do I need? How do I become an advocate for myself? How do I know what I need? Like if I'm not given access, like you were saying, to all of these things that could help me, how do I know that they're even there? And it leads towards choice, and with choice and an understanding of themselves, like that's the whole backing of SEL and CRSE. It's like knowing myself, knowing what I need, but also having people in my environment being there, also knowing me and showing me different things. So there's this huge partnership between a teacher and a student and the other people in the classroom, where when you give choice, that's advocacy. When you show students what supports are out there, you're having them understand and be an advocate for themselves, but that also leads towards self-efficacy. Like how beautiful is that? Giving that a student like has a goal in mind of where they want to go, and they're able to advocate for themselves to independently get there on their own with their own needs. Because we're also dealing with not just students with IEPs or not students who are ENL, but there's also a multitude of students with something that we call interrupted education after the last 3 years, right? And so like all of these pieces, like, you know, there's students who are, you know, quote unquote typically developing, or, you know, whatever the newest trend is of the normal, like everybody in the world, right? Like we've all needed, you know, we all need to know, like we're different now than we were before. So like what do we need as individuals to progress and move forward? So it's really that knowing that you're giving access in your classroom is the biggest piece, and how, you know, what does, and that access will look different in every period of the day. You know, sometimes you may be trugging along with a group that just for whatever reason, they're in sync, they've been engaged, their minds are firing, and they're like, let's go. And this other class may be, you know, still in that space of finding out like how I connect with the content that's being presented, and what do I need to be independent in the classroom. So I feel like there were some very beautiful things that happened, and I don't think you should ever feel like you've lessened something when you're giving students choice and you're giving students an opportunity to advocate for their own needs. Because advocacy and communication and independence are the most beautiful gifts that can be given in a classroom. Okay, so, oh yay, we're trucking along. So accessing the IEPs, just as an FYI, and we wanted to put that out there, that everybody has access to them. And if you don't or you don't know how, your administrator will give you access through your DOE credentials on CSIS. You just Google CSIS and it pops up and you use your DOE credentials to log in, and all of the students that you work with that have IEPs will be there. And if they're not, there should be, maybe it's one of your APs or an IEP coordinator, just talk to them and they will give you access to it. But that's one of the things as part of the 408s that everybody's part of that. So you all have access to all this amazing, helpful information.
You can even ask the para or the student.
Yeah, also ask the student.
Really?
And that's the big thing too, and I love that that came up from so many people, is the student is such an active member of this process. And a lot of times, you know, people don't ask. They like read this, they have a preconceived notion, and so it's being like very reflective in our own practice, saying like, okay, I'm gonna meet this student today, and they could be a completely different individual in my period versus the next classroom, because maybe they have a better a relationship with you. Maybe you've saw them in a different light. Asset thinking is so amazing when we think about how we're working with students in the Department of Education. Like what beautiful things are they bringing into the world that is the classroom that we have? Yeah, in the back.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, it brings back to the point where we sometimes, she said, sometimes we see they have different, what's in the IEP, don't have those needs in the classroom, in the theater classroom, and I find that sometimes it's a trigger depending on the subject and or the person where they have those management needs because they're not doing well in math and ELA, and so they will do something to get away from that. So evading behavior, and that's one of their management needs. And whereas when they get to the theater class, I tell them, there's no wrong answer, so just do something.
Exactly.
And then they're like, oh, okay.
It's a completely failure-free environment.
Right.
It's such an
And
amazing
so
thing. It's
That's
so
why
empowering.
that need particularly, you may say, hey, they've mastered it in this setting. So.
And even that, it's you know, it's a very much a failure-free environment.
Yes.
There's a huge connection to self and self-expression that comes out of it, and every nuance of your classroom in theater, it's all about taking from the students, taking from the environment, and seeing what they need, and you're seeing it like manifest naturally, which is a very exciting thing. So, yes.
Question. For context, I'm K-5, so all of my IEP students are in ICTs. How do you allow for
Would
students?
you explain what ICT stands for?
Integrated co-teaching.
Thank
So
you.
they're mixed in with the general ed students. And I do a lot of group work. But if a student, according to their IEP, needs extra time, how do you manage that when they're working with a group that's mixed with gen ed students? So I see them once a week for 50 minutes, and there's not a lot of time to begin with, and I don't want them to fall behind with their group just because they need that extra time. Like, I just don't know how to, I don't know how to give that to them.
That's okay. So, I mean, it's task-oriented. We'll hear from the floor, because they may not need extra time all the time. Like, it's not something that, like, oh, they need 2 hours to do each little thing. Like, they may be really engaged with the content area and just have, there is an internal, intrinsic motivator in your classroom, and they're, completing the task within even more quickly than the students, their age level peers.
Because you're thinking about testing accommodations and more time. I mean, that's literally for testing, right? And not necessarily for, for activities.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to elaborate. I guess I'm thinking in terms of when we do reading or writing activities, if they need.
I would just supply every, kind of creating the choice, right? If there's a group that's reading out loud and a group that's reading silently, and then maybe pairing that student up with a stronger reader so they can
Peer
read
modeling.
together.
Also,
Peer coaching, peer modeling is huge.
program.
Okay, we're gonna have that here.
And also thinking about if it needs to be written or if it can be done through drawing or if they can sequence something with visuals.
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, like right there, sequencing with visuals. Maybe there's something that there's an accommodation for the text being read aloud to them through a natural reader or through a paired reading with a friend in the class, where you're not necessarily singling out that group. I love that you had like mixed pairings because that's such a beautiful thing in cluster classes. But just thinking about all the options that are there, and they can be set up in the groups where students can have a choice of which text they're taking from that group, that the options are there for them.
Question, since you are the director of District 75, which I would say you would see this a lot, when you go in and see an arts teacher, well no, I'm going to use you as an asset because,
Totally. Do it.
I don't get to see you every day. But my question is what do you expect to see from an arts teacher when you look in an arts classroom to visually see differentiation right off the bat and modification? Like what's something you look for?
So I feel like when you look into a room, you look to see, now this is just from the vision of D75 and like what our instructional missions are. You know, it could be different in districts 1 through 32. But when you go in, you're looking to see that all the students are participating and that the students are participating together. So if you're in an inclusive classroom setting, that the students are not necessarily, like, so we have over here, we have paired groupings where the students are included. The students have choice, where the options are there. You know, if I would go over and the student, you know, say they're in high school and all the text is an 11th grade level, and I look over and the student is not necessarily engaged, which engagement does look different, but has there been an attempt to give the student access to the content that's happening at that moment? Does that kind of slip? So it's not necessarily that I would walk in and be like, oh my gosh, there's pictorial symbols everywhere, there's tape on the floor, because, you know, there could be a student that in September that's needed, but now it's January and they've been practicing stage directions, maybe they don't need this many supports anymore. But there comes in, when you come in, you're gonna be, you know, when I go into a classroom and I'm going to look and see, like, is there an attempt that the supports are there? And then I'll ask either the student, like, what do they need? And I'll say to the teacher, you know, like, what are some supports or accommodations that you've provided the class? You know, but usually I go around and you take, you know, like you're taking some like soft data just by walking around and asking the students what they're working on, or, you know, what are you doing next? And finding out, like, is the student aware of the goal of the lesson for today? And how are they able to do that? And do they need any support? So, you know, it could be somebody, like if I walk into a student and they have like high support needs, with, you know, where they may need a lot of visuals cues, they may need a lot of like structured navigational pieces on the floor, like I'll look to see if those are there and that the supports are in place. Because I mean, you can, I know that sounds pretty silly, but in a theater class, you so rarely walk in and not everybody is engaged in it. You know, I feel like that's the beauty of arts, that I want to say that art teachers are so creative and it's inherent in their nature, I know. And it's also inherent in our craft to do things on a repetitive basis, right? You practice for mastery in music, visual art, theater, dance. Like I feel like people that work in the arts naturally work better at giving access to students with disabilities, and we may have to cut that from the tape, but no, I'm just kidding. I really do, because you're creative in nature, you figure it out, you're constantly problem solving. So I think that the biggest thing that I see is if there's an attempt to support the students, and if the students are doing what the task is in the class. You know, and so if a student walks in, like I said, and they're you know, struggling with a script and there's no assistive technology to help them, I'm gonna be like, okay, you know, like there's all of these in-app software features that you can have a mic or, you know, a headphone in somebody's ear and it's reading the dialogue, or there's symbols on a page or somebody's cueing them, like as an example of what you would look like if they're working on dialogue. Does that help? Yeah. Perfect. Great. How's everybody feeling?
Good.
Great. Oh my gosh, I was so nervous that this was gonna be like too much. Okay.
Good stuff.
So we're gonna do a little practice.
So Amanda, we're gonna have 10 minutes till the session's over now. So we need to adjust.
Okay. We can do this together. How does okay, we'll leave it to the group. We'll give choice. Right? So the next step of the activities is we were going to show you an as-is activity, give some examples of some goals that students have, and have a conversation of the activity that we gave and how we can adapt and modify, give the accommodations that are needed, and then let you break into small groups and discuss based on those goals how you would adapt and or modify an activity that you commonly do in your class. Would you like to break out into small groups and have a discussion on things that you're working on in your classes, or would you like to do a collective exercise? Collective. Votes for collective. Say aye.
Aye.
Nay. Anyone opposed? Okay. Those are the other hat I wear, student government. I'm just kidding. Okay. So, we are going to, do we have a volunteer so this is the activity that we're doing in class today. So we're practicing stage direction. You're gonna select a mini script, read the mini script, and perform. So this is your actor note. This is your script, I'm sorry, we didn't print it out. But enters downstage right hurriedly and stops to tie shoes, center, says hello, upstage left. Would anybody like to model that for us?
We're gonna have tiny stage.
Tiny
From
stage.
Upstage, downstage, right, left. Tiny stage.
I'll do it.
Perfect.
Yeah, this is good.
That is your,
Hello.
that's your script. Actor 1, you're actor 1.
Okay. Enters down. Right. Hurriedly stops, ties shoes, center. Okay, so this is my stage.
Yes.
This is stage right.
And you say hello,
This is
upstage
stage
left.
right. Hello?
Super hot.
Yay.
Well done.
Did you want me to actually move upstage left or say hello to upstage left?
It was unclear.
It
Let's make
didn't
a
say.
decision. Let's make a decision to say hello from upstage left. Or which would you like? To say
Well, I
hello
did
to-
what I
hello,
thought,
yeah,
but it doesn't
was
matter.
great.
I can
It
say
was
hello
fine.
too.
It was fine. You get to do it again.
I'm
rehearsal.
versatile.
And you can decide. So you're deciding on whether to physically be upstage left to deliver the line, or are you directing the line to upstage left? Those are the two options you articulated. You decide, actor.
Hello.
That was a perfect happy mistake. I love that. Not of you, of us and our directions, right? Which happens when we're in our classes. So, knowing that, remember that space where there was the clarification of what was actually needed, right? So, planning, right? Planning on the fly, restructured, re-explained.
What was needed, or also open-ended to discover.
I was gonna say
Honest-
there's choice on the app.
There's a choice, yes.
Yeah, so
Because it's about interpretation of, we get a script, we then interpret our understanding of the map.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we've understood. Perfect. Okay. So here's our information from 3 different students, right? Because we have a lot in our classes, right? 12 to 15 sometimes. X will advocate for himself by asking for help from an adult 5 times throughout the school day using preferred mode of communication. So basically the gist of that is asking for help when needed. They will follow a personal schedule going by the designated, or going to the designated area and beginning the task. That they learn from visual and verbal directions as well as modeling from staff. And then
Student number 3.
Student number 3 is will verbally communicate in sentences of 3 to 4 words in order to greet familiar family members, staff, peers by name and answer WH questions. A lot of information there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the gist of what those goals are is asking for help, the student needing the goal of following so it was their following their own personal schedule, which that personal schedule can be throughout the day and it can be throughout a task. And the task was following that stage direction cue. And then 3 to 4 word responses answering WH questions. So
We have these 3 students in our class of 27 students. How might we go about modifying or adapting that stage direction script event to try and make it accessible for these 3, for all 27 students, specifically these 3?
yeah. And we may not need to modify it, right? Like, it was pretty straightforward.
I mean, one thing you could do is instead of hello as the dialogue, it could be each kid has something else to say. Like, it could be like, how are you feeling today? What did you eat for lunch today? Like, that could be a way to get student 3 to like answer a question in like a low stakes way, because it's kind of like fun and open ended.
Because part of it was introducing themselves. Could be like, hello, my name's Amanda.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Amanda. 5. More than the goal.
I have, like, we're doing stage directions now, and what I did was I taped off a box with 9 little boxes inside, and then the wings, upstage, downstage, so they knew where to go, and we played a game so they can figure out where upstage was, and
beautiful.
And I feel that that would help student number 2.
Mm-hmm. With that personal schedule. Beautiful.
Poly spots, a great
Absolutely.
tool to have if you do not already, that can help illuminate the physical mapping similar to what our fellow colleague here is articulating. So perhaps in this event, actually, I'm gonna give a different color so I will know actually where upstage right is. My center is purple, my up left is this. That just helped give a visual adaptation that others could use too if they wish.
Sometimes what I do with my students is I have them create like a board game of stage directions, especially since I move from class to class and each classroom may not have adequate space to physically get up and do it. So by doing that, you can visualize even just like on a piece of cardboard, and the students can not only step into the role as actor, but you can have director and playwriter where they're seeing things from above, where they're mapping it out, where the game is placed, showing the rest of the class so they're getting that actor's perspective. And in which I feel that would help out all 3 students do that within a smaller activity.
Yeah, so that is something where that may be a precursor, right? So what are we doing before? What do we need to teach before to make sure the students are successful, right? That goes with knowing all aspects of your content area and like all of the aspects of stage direction. Like before they're able to do this, we clearly have to teach like, where is the stage and how are we gonna do that to support the students?
For the first one, asking for help and what can we do. If you know that something, because I have students sometimes need that, and I will ask them to help me out first. So I'll ask for their help, and I'll say, let us do this, and then I'll give them a question that may be challenging for them, that I know is going to be challenging for them, and at times they'll stare at me, and I'm like, that's okay if you don't understand. That's okay if you don't know. Can you, because obviously, and I always say, obviously, I've done something that you don't understand. Maybe one of your fellow students can help. Can you choose a student to help you? And they will choose whatever student they feel comfortable with and ask that person for help.
It's also modeling simply how to ask for help.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is huge.
I think
Modeling.
students don't always know how to do that either.
Ask it there.
It's great. It's in there. It's great. That's so true.
The idea of stage directions can be really difficult because it's mirrored.
Yeah.
They have to understand that it's from the actor's perspective. They have to understand that upstage is like going up the ramp, and coming down towards the audience is like going to listen to a secret that they have to tell you. So it's like when I taught it, I did the Cupid Shuffle, and I said, what does this possibly have to do? Like theater, why would we be doing this dance?
So
and
fun.
hint, it's nothing about the dance.
Yeah.
And they were able to, like when I told you to go to the right, who was actually going to the right? And they go, we were. I said, well, what was I doing? You're going to the left. I said, that's because it's flipped. So I did a mirroring exercise with some of my SE kids.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so good. We have some great things, great ideas happening.
That is brilliant.
Yeah, so here we're just an example of support for one of the students that we had that was creating that visual schedule, and maybe they need a map that, and you know, the student at the beginning of the year, maybe it's like the first card, it's just the red circle that's at the front, right? And then you're prompting them and giving them the next one. And then eventually they can follow this map, and then next step is they're navigating the stage independently. And this takes time. Like, it's not gonna happen in a day. I mean, maybe. Like this, they could be so inspired by theater that they're mastering every skill in your class because you've made them feel comfortable and confident and you have this repertoire with them. Or it could take a couple months, and that's okay. You know, like these things take a year to accomplish, and you're not necessarily going to work at every skill at the same time, but just thinking about how you can take, don't feel, I guess our purpose today was making sure that you don't feel like you have to hit every goal in every lesson, but or that you have to section the child out to accomplish those goals, that it's okay to add it in and do exactly what you're doing because it can benefit the whole, right? By giving access to everybody.
A reminder, you're doing this already. Shifting our thinking on morsels, not the whole cake. How are we gonna make the cake though? How we might go about still making the cake. And give yourself permission to pause and be in the moment so you can be responsive versus reactionary. Give space and grace for yourself and all the students. And again, we're shifting the topic perhaps to student interests, which you've all highlighted as well. And then to give some thinking about universal design for learning, that it's through the specificity we get to the universality. Or that being content choice, subject to get through the macro human experiences. We are
And
at 11.
Oh, perfect. That's beautiful. Moving right along. One of the things that I wanted to say is that even in, thank you so much. What was your first name?
Carolyn.
Carolyn?
Yes.
It's very nice to meet you. And when it was such a beautiful thing that even in the nature of Carolyn doing a task, like we were able to be responsive to the needs and understanding that it's okay if the plan that I had set out wasn't as clear as we thought, right? And that knowing that that plan that you set out can be adjusted and it's not the end of the world if you're shifting and rethinking and reshaping, right? Because I feel like as creatives, we're constantly able to make those shifts. And it could even be intentional where we wanted her to ask us for help, which it wasn't, it was my error. But I was like, it was a happy accident. But it's okay that things can be shifted and you can be responsive to the students in your class.
Thank you, everyone. We have 15